this program could not have been possible without Dr. Tahir Rahman reaching out to the museum almost 2 years ago about his book, Extreme Overvalued Beliefs. And we're so thrilled that we were finally able to have the opportunity to bring him to Dallas, thanks to board member Dr. Temitope Adedolapo. I hope I did that. And he recently joined our board, and we've just done this wonderful collaboration with UT Southwestern's Department of Psychiatry today. All the programs that we offer here at the museum are meant to cast a new lens or dimension on an aspect of the Kennedy assassination. So all the materials and programs that we do and the oral histories that we collect add new texture that we will incorporate into a wonderful new exhibition that will be, I hope, groundbreaking in the not too distant future. So we appreciate you coming here, and we hope that if you have stories to share that you will reach out to us and continue with our oral history project. But I also want to thank the staff, and we've got some wonderful new people on our team that you have met, and I hope that you will have a chance to talk to them on your way out. But anyway, our next program in February is also very important by a local author. Rick Lesberg has written a book called Two Societies, The Riots of 1967 and the Kerner Report. And then in March, Dr. Stephen Butler from the University of Texas, Austin, has got a very interesting topic on JFK and Mexico, Catholicism, memory, and mourning across borders. These are all topics that we have not explored before. But tonight especially is really compelling because Dr. Tahir Rahman has got amazing insight into the psyche, I'm not sure if I'm using the right terminology here, of Lee Harvey Oswald. And of course, everybody's fascinated with him. But there's so many parallels, not only with him and the crime that he committed, or crimes that he committed, but also other aspects of the Kennedy assassination, which are highly relevant today. So I'm hoping that tonight will give you a deeper understanding of an area that is of interest. And now I won't waste any more time, but introduce our wonderful speaker, Dr. Tahir Rahman from Washington University in St. Louis.
Ooh. Well, thank you for that wonderful, nice introduction. So I'm an associate professor of psychiatry at Washington University in St. Louis, and I got interested in this topic because I really felt a need to end the school shooting epidemic that we have in this country. And in doing that research, I was trying to help develop some better, more concise criteria for identifying and trying to thwart or change the trajectory of an individual who may come to the radar, so to speak. And so I wanted to briefly talk about the Goldwater rule. I'm not supposed to diagnose anybody as a psychiatrist. That's APA rules. And we've all seen some of the controversies that have come out of that. But a more modern interpretation of that is if public safety is involved, and there's a lot of data on individuals that making opinions is more acceptable in today's world. And in the end, I'll talk about our moonshot, which was President Kennedy's dream to get to the moon, which is also the topic of my first book, We Came in Peace for All Mankind. And ending the school shootings is something that I think JFK would have been proud to see this museum doing if it ever decided to embrace this goal of ending this carnage that we're seeing in our schools. Gerald Posner is the author of Case Closed, the top right there. And prior to reading Posner's book, I watched Oliver Stone's movie, JFK, and was convinced that, oh, there's a theory, there's all these conspiracy theories, and there must be something to this, or no one would believe it. But it turns out Posner has done a wonderful job with Case Closed, and I highly recommend it to anybody, especially if you're wondering about conspiracies or whether there was one or not. And he helped me assemble a lot of the material. So I actually mapped out the proximal warning behaviors and other signs that I'll talk about here in this talk. And he helped me confirm whether some of those things were there or not, and showed me some other things that I didn't know about. Of course, Case Open would be the book that was written right after Case Closed because people want to continue stirring this area. One thing that Posner asked me, he said, "You're a psychiatrist, can you tell me why people believe in all these conspiracy theories of any kind, not just this one? You know, there's people who think the moon landing didn't happen or that 9/11 was done by the government, and this continues to plague modern society." And so I kind of put together a few thoughts of my own about this. And I think that big events and big causes, people expect a major event to have a very complex explanation. And people are uncomfortable with uncertainty. Conspiracies reduce anxiety by creating a clearer story for them. People have a distrust of authority figures, skepticism towards government, which fuels alternative explanations. I think that after this event, we had the Vietnam War, we had Watergate, and people really began to question government's role and deception done by government. There's an emotional investment. Beliefs become shared, reinforced, and resistant to challenge. And there's identity and meaning. People feeling in the know provides them some status and belonging. So there's just a few psychological thoughts. And with modern era now, we're seeing a lot of subcultures. And the worry that I have are the school shooter subcultures, which are shared belief systems. And after the Columbine attacks, which many of you may remember, outside of Colorado, outside of Denver, Dylan Harris and Klebold did the mass shooting of their own school. And many of the modern school shooters emulate them and see them and hold them in high regard. And so that's a big worry with this type of subculture. And so digital subcultures are the new threat. I wanted to show you that Oswald's legacy continues today, and Oswald was not only fame-seeking, but I think that he would be proud to see others following some of his behavior. And this is a photograph of the Chicago Highland Park shooter, Robert Crimo. And you can see here in the back, he has a poster of a newspaper headline, and it's the newspaper headline of Oswald as he was being transferred from the jail to an outside jail. He was shot by Jack Ruby, and here you can see that he's identifying with this shooting. Not only is he identifying with Oswald, but he also emulated the pathway we call, which is the method, and he used a sniper's perch on the 4th of July in Chicago Highland Park in 2022 and killed 10 people. So the question I wanted to try to answer with the chapter in my book, Extreme Overvalued Beliefs, is could modern tools have flagged Lee Harvey Oswald as a threat, as a terrorist threat or a threat to the president? Could the assassination have been prevented? And ultimately, what can we do to stop future attacks, and mostly for children and schools, what can we do? I think it's important to have a good understanding of fixations. So a lot of my work centers around identifying these rigid beliefs or fixations that humans can sometimes have. And the most common ones seen in psychiatry are delusion and obsession. Now, all of us have heard the word delusion. You know, they'll say, well, he was delusional about the government or who won the election, or he was obsessed with guns, people will say. Well, both of those are incorrect uses of these terms because psychiatrists have very specific definitions of these terms. A delusion is a fixed false belief that's idiosyncratic. In other words, only that individual believes it, other people don't believe it. And that usually occurs in illnesses like schizophrenia. An important Texas case that might help you understand that is Andrea Yates, who sequentially drowned 5 of her children in her home bathtub. Some of you may remember this case. And she did that because she believed that Satan was within her. She also believed that by having her children die before the age of accountability in the Bible, that their souls would not go to hell. So by dying at such a young age, she believed that they would be saved somehow from going to hell. And she also thought that if she were killed in an electric chair for doing this, that Satan would die within her as well. So this was a big case in Texas. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity because she had postpartum psychosis, which was very well documented from psychiatric hospitals that she had been in. So that's a delusion. An obsession, by contrast, is an intrusive, unwanted thought or belief. And typically what we'll see with this is something like an anxiety disorder in which an individual will have a belief that they have germs and they need to wash them compulsively. And they want the thoughts to stop because the thoughts take over their entire life. And those obsessions are unwanted, intrusive, difficult to control, and individuals will often seek help for them. So they'll come to the clinic, psychiatry, even their primary care doctor, and say, I think I have OCD, I can't get rid of these thoughts. Sometimes individuals will even have thoughts like harming a loved one or harming a child, and they don't understand why they're having those thoughts and they want them to go away. We also think these individuals are at low risk of harm to anyone. They are anxious, they want them to stop, and can't control them. Medications do help. Medications help obsessions. SSRIs, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, work for that. Delusions are treated with antipsychotic drugs and can have variable effects on that as well. Let's talk about normal fixations for a second. So we all have to fixate on something, otherwise we'd never get anything done. You had to fixate on getting to this building today and getting your GPS or whatever and figuring out where to park, and we have to fixate. You have to fixate to build a home or to finish school or to take a test or to pass your exams and credits. So fixations are important, they're normal, they're biologically adaptive. Falling in love is another example of a fixation that people will say they can't stop thinking about the person that they have fallen in love with. So many of these are biologically rooted. By contrast, an extreme overvalued belief is one that's shared by others in a person's culture, religion, or subculture. It's often relished, amplified, and defended by the individual, and they may carry out violent behavior in its service. And so the thinking becomes more binary, simplistic, and absolute with EOBs, extreme overvalued beliefs. I'll give you concrete examples to make it easy to understand. So as I said, just to repeat, that it's one that's shared by others in a person's cultural, religious, or subcultural group. It's often relished, amplified, and defended by the possessor and should be differentiated from an obsession or delusion because it's different. The belief grows more dominant over time, more refined, more resistant to challenge. The individual has an intense emotional commitment to the belief and may carry out violent behavior in its service. Okay, so this is the new definition that we're using now in this threat assessment world. It comes from the work of Carl Wernicke, who was a neurologist who actually, in 1892, first described overvalued ideas. So it has a scholarship associated with it. Archetype Killers is a latest paper that I've published where we looked at assassins, terrorists, and school shooters to see if there was a thread that was common amongst them. And what we found is that these three elements seem to converge in these killers. An example would be that they have, in the top right, an archetype, a thymotic drive, and an EOB, and I'll explain a thymotic drive here in a second. So the first part is the shared, emotionally charged, culturally shared beliefs, distorted archetypes which have roles like being a victim, a warrior, a hero, a martyr, a savior, or an outlaw. And I'll give you examples of that here shortly. And these provide the narrative that justify a person's actions. The thymotic drive is a deep need for need for recognition, dignity, justice, or a malign concern to stand above others. And the first person to describe this was Plato, centuries ago, and then some other German psychiatrists have also talked about amour propre, which means a malign concern to stand above others. Okay, I'll give you an example here. In 2011, Anders Breivik, this man killed 77 people in Norway, and it was the most horrific attack seen really in Europe in a long time. And the people in Norway, this was like their 9/11, it really shattered the entire country. But basically, Breivik was a right-wing extremist. He wanted to cleanse Norway of immigrants, Islamic people moving into his country, he thought, and believed that by cleansing Europe of these outside forces, that would make Norway a better place. And he wrote about these things and was strongly opposed to the Islamization of Europe and multicultural advocacy of liberal politicians. And so he detonated 2 bombs in downtown Oslo and then went to an island in Utøya where young people of the more liberal faction of Norway were having a youth camp and began shooting people there and killed around 79 people. He also believed that he would be a savior of Christianity, a Knight Templar, and he had a warrior soldier, and he's wearing a US Marine outfit. Now let me explain that to you for a second. This is a Norwegian citizen wearing a United States Marines outfit. And he really was involved with political ideologies centering around George Bush and the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan, and really identified with this warrior mentality. So here he is wearing the Marine uniform, which he ordered online, and also some of these medals. So his thymotic drive was that he wanted recognition. He even wanted a medal, a military medal for combating what he called Islamic colonization of Europe. And he was in the courtroom doing Nazi salutes. The reason I picked this case to start some of my research was because the first group of forensic psychiatrists who interviewed him thought he had schizophrenia. They thought these were delusions and that he was insane. About 6 months went by. The country was really upset to even hear this, that this man could have a psychotic mental illness. So the judge ordered another evaluation, and the second group had more experience with forensic cases, and he also improved somewhat in his rhetoric by the time 6 months had gone by in jail. And they decided that he had right-wing extremist views and not psychotic and not schizophrenic. So, and that is in the end what the judge decided as well. So no insanity defense for him. All right, coming back to the United States, some of you may remember I was in med school in 1995 when the Alfred Murrah attack occurred, where 168 people were killed by a homemade fertilizer bomb made of ammonium nitrate fertilizer in a Ryder truck that Timothy McVeigh, Terry Nichols placed in front of this building. And there was even a daycare in this building, and 168 people were killed. It's the largest terrorist attack in the United States before 9/11. And the perpetrator was led by this man, Timothy McVeigh, who you can see here. This is his arrest picture. And he's wearing a shirt, and you can kind of make out, some of you may have seen this shirt. It has Abraham Lincoln's head on it, and it says Sic Semper Tyrannis on it. And Timothy McVeigh was a former U.S. Army member of the U.S. Army, and he wanted to be a part of the Special Forces, but he never made it to the Special Forces. And his dream was to be an ultimate warrior. That's what he told his sister. And since he didn't make that, he decided after he came here to join a right-wing militia group, the Patriot Movement. And in this group, they thought he was so extreme, the Patriot people did, that they didn't want him to be in his, they didn't want him to be a part of their group, because he wanted to do something. He's like, you guys are just sitting around. I want to fight and do something. So they thought he was dangerous. So imagine an extremist group thinking you're too dangerous. So we call that failure to affiliate, which is one of the warning signs of a terrorist attack. So the shirt says Sic Semper Tyrannis, which for those of you who like history might recall that this was what John Wilkes Booth said as he leaped from the stage after shooting President Abraham Lincoln on April 15, 1865. He said, Sic Semper Tyrannis, the South shall be avenged, and thus always to tyrants is what this literally means, the Latin. Okay, so points to remember are that these beliefs are shared by others in a subculture. They're relished, amplified, and defended by the individual. Their beliefs become simplistic, binary, and absolute. And there's an intense emotional commitment to the belief, and it may lead to violence. Okay. All right, so I'm going to shift gears over to the reason why you all are here, and that was to hear about Lee Harvey Oswald and his warning signs and behaviors from his actions. Okay, so I use this as a teaching slide in the medical school and residency where I teach, because on the left we have Oswald's assassination of JFK, which is predatory, planned, purposeful, cognitive, and focused. And on the right we have Jack Ruby killing Oswald, which is intense autonomic arousal, reactive, emotional, and affective. In other words, more impulsive. So these are two different kinds of nervous system involved actions. And so people who conduct school shootings, terrorism acts, assassins, often are completely ice cold with their abilities. And some of them have practiced or have done other kinds of actions which are preparation up to the targeted attack. Okay, so the county medical examiner did an autopsy of Lee Harvey Oswald and found that he had a scar on his left deltoid and a scar on his left arm with the cross-hatching on it. The left deltoid scar was from him telling people that he accidentally shot himself when he was in the Marines. And it turns out that in Japan, his unit was deployed there, and they were going to be shifting over to the Philippines, and he didn't want to go there. He wanted to stay in Japan because he met this girl there. So instead of going with his unit, his fellow Marines all thought that he purposely shot himself in his arm with a .22 pistol that he owned to avoid going to the Philippines. So that's scar number one. Scar number two on his left arm with the cross-hatching on it is sutures from him cutting himself when he was in the Soviet Union. So Oswald defected from the United States, moved to Russia where he met his wife. When he moved to Russia, the Russian government was very suspicious of Lee Harvey Oswald because he's an American former soldier, and they're like, is this guy a spy? Why is he here? So they were following him, monitoring him. Well, he insisted he wanted to stay, and they said, you got to go back. We don't want you here. So in response to that, he cut himself and was found unconscious, bleeding in his hotel bathtub, and was taken to the hospital where they sutured him, and that's why he has that cross-hatching on his autopsy report. Okay. While in the Marines, Oswald fired rifles. You have to be able to shoot 100 yards to qualify for this. And Oswald not only was able to do that, but he actually excelled at even 200 yards or 300 yards. And he did best on the rapid fire part of the scoring test. To give you an idea, there's the picture from the 6th floor here. I sometimes joke with my residents that a really good NFL quarterback could probably throw a football from that window to the limousine. It's about 59 yards to the shot that exited Kennedy's throat and 88 yards to the fatal headshot. Most quarterbacks can throw in the NFL 60. I bet Patrick Mahomes could hit I'm from Kansas City, sorry. Could hit the limousine type of structure from the 6th floor. To give you just a little bit of contrast, at the University of Texas, there was a shooter, Charles Whitman, who shot an incredible 500 yards from the top of the tower, hitting students that were members of the University of Texas there. And he had such pinpoint accuracy, that's what witnesses said, that you couldn't hide from him because he would find you and shoot you, and people were being killed everywhere. And 500 yards was his accuracy. He was another former member of the military and had training. Okay. Recently, the Trump rally shooter, you may recall Thomas Crooks, did an internet search. And what does he search? How far away was Oswald from Kennedy? This is what he's searching. And you can see him on the right there. You may recall that photograph. So he shot at President Trump at about 157 yards distance, killed a member of the rally that was attending the rally. And we all know that Trump survived and was bleeding on his face from shrapnel or something hitting him. So Thomas Crooks on the left failed to affiliate with his high school rifle team. And you can see here this intense motive to prove himself and some fame seeking that may have been going on here, but the details of this have not been all released yet. Okay. This is the TRAP 18. It's called the Terrorist Radicalization Assessment Protocol, made by my friend and colleague, Dr. Reed Malloy, who's a noted scholar on preventing terrorist attacks. And this is a very validated, excellent inter-rater reliability and has predictive validity, has been used worldwide, is used by the US Secret Service for monitoring individuals that come to the radar. And you can see here that there's proximal warning behaviors and distal characteristics. So there's 10 distal characteristics and 8 proximal warning behaviors that are coded by the person who's doing the assessment. So these are professionals who are trained to do this type of work. Many of them are law enforcement, security, and it takes courses to go through to get trained on how to do this. So I'm not going to sit here and try to explain exactly how this works. But I will say it's not a predictive tool, it's a prevention tool. So if people flag positive for some of these things, we're not saying that we're predicting that they're going to do something. We're saying, gee, this is a storm clouds on the horizon, and let's do something before there's a tornado, that sort of thing. Okay, so in the book, on the chapter on Oswald that I've written, I've identified 5 proximal warning behaviors from that tool, the TRAP 18. Fixation, identification, pathway, novel aggression, last resort. So each of these have definitions, and I'll show you a few of them. We don't have time to go deep into all of them, but I'll show you some. And then he also fit 8 of the 10 distal characteristics of a lone actor attacker, a lone actor person. Personal grievance and moral outrage. He was framed by an ideology. He failed to affiliate with the Soviet Union, so that's why that one gets coded. And that's an important one for later. Thwarting of occupational goals, changes in thinking and emotion, having a mental disorder, being creative and innovative, and having a history of criminal violence. In one important part of Oswald's history, he pulled a knife on his sister-in-law. So in 7th grade, Oswald had a terrible childhood. Even before he was born, his father died while his mother was still pregnant with him. So about 2 months after his father died, she gave birth to Lee. And you can imagine how the family was just plunged into chaos, not having the main breadwinner in their family around anymore. Lee went to 11 different schools and was truant, constantly truant and in trouble, and eventually had to see a psychiatrist, actually. In one of the court systems, he was ordered to see a psychiatrist, and I'll show you that here in a moment. So Oswald had fixations pretty early in his life. At age 13, Lee saw a woman handing out flyers talking about Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, whose photograph is on the left. These were convicted spies who were selling secrets, nuclear secrets, to the Soviets. And you can imagine what that would have been like in the 1950s. So they were captured and executed by the federal government. In fact, she's one of the few women, there's only been like 3 or 4, that the federal government has executed in US history. The other one was Mary Surratt, who was involved in the Lincoln conspiracy to kidnap and kill President Lincoln. She was also executed. And this woman, Ethel, was also executed. Oswald proselytized political beliefs in his life later by distributing Fair Play for Cuba leaflets in New Orleans, though not a single person took these flyers that he was handing out. And when he was arrested, he told the agents who were interrogating him that he's a Marxist-Leninist, and he was very clear to them. And very gamey with them too. You know, they would ask him a question like, why do you have a fake ID? It said H. Heidel on it, which is the alias he used to order the gun that he owned. And he would say things like, you figure it out. You know, just very obstinate and rebellious towards investigators. Okay, identification. This is a very useful teaching picture that I use with people who are learning about threat assessment, because Oswald here is all kinds of things going on in this photograph. First of all, he's holding a rifle, and on the other hand, he has the worker and the militant propaganda. These are communist, left-wing newspapers and magazines from that time period. Some of those are still around today in terms of these writings. And he insisted to have this photograph taken by his wife, by Marina. And she at first was like, I don't want to do this. And he just kept insisting, please take this picture of me. So she did. And at the time, Oswald was working at a photograph plant here in Dallas and knew how to have enlargements made of pictures. So he had enlargements made, and then he wanted to give those to their friends. And on the back, he signed some of them. On one of them, Marina has written, he kept saying, I'm going to be a hunter of fascists. He kept saying that to her. She got tired of hearing that. So on the back of one of the photos that Lee signed for their friends, she wrote, hunter of fascists, with exclamation points. And then she put, ha, 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 mocking him. And mocking this behavior, which I think she got really tired of hearing this stuff from him. So she wrote that on the back, gave it to the friends, and this was later discovered after the assassination. Some of this material surfaced. And Marina explained to investigators that her husband was very much into fame-seeking, and he was interested in Dostoevsky's novel, Crime and Punishment, where it's morally okay to kill somebody for loftier goals, is kind of what the Dostoevsky's novel, Crime and Punishment, is about. And there's another book called The Idiot, which Dostoevsky wrote, that he was also infatuated with, and a ton of communist propaganda was also found that he was studying, learning, liking, relishing. Another Texas case. All these are Texas cases. I haven't figured out why yet. Here we have the Fort Hood shooting, one of the most horrific terrorist attacks in US history, because it happened on a military base. And Malik Naidal Hassan was actually an army psychiatrist and perpetrated this attack. And he had a long history of radicalizing and selectively looking at Quranic verses that dealt with killing people who are non-believers. And this radical cleric, Anwar al-Awlaki, was making proselytizing and making statements about jihadism. And Hassan was listening to these tapes and absorbing all this material. And just by listening to it, he became radicalized, and his mother died, and he decided to take out as many of his army fellow as he could. His last resort was that he was supposed to be deployed to Afghanistan, and instead of going with his unit to Afghanistan, he decided to kill his colleagues. So he's on death row. All right, so we talk about symbolic imprinters. So you saw in Hassan's case, he's listening to this radical cleric and getting awed by it. And we think that awe is an important emotion in these radicalization processes. In other words, people see something that another individual has done or is trying to convince people to do, and they'll absorb that and get awed by the message. Similar to a religious experience, or seeing the Grand Canyon, or seeing a huge piece of artwork, people are awed by those things. These individuals are sometimes awed by the material that they're absorbing because they've never seen it before. It's novel, it's unique, and it wows the brain. And we think that wowing the brain allows that material to become embedded more rapidly. This also happens in eating disorders. So an adolescent girl who's in those formative years might see a pretty model or a picture of a skinny girl and then want to try to be like that. And that losing some weight at the beginning has a powerful wowing effect on these girls. And they'll then identify with being fat even though they're not. So they're 90 pounds and telling people they're overweight, and sometimes they die from suicide or starvation. So here I talked a little bit about the imprinters from Oswald's life, from the propaganda he's holding, and I talked a little bit about his difficult childhood. So he saw a psychiatrist at age 13, Renatus Hartog, and I'll show you that assessment here in a little bit. But I wanted to share with you this quickly because Nicholas Cruz, who perpetrated a horrific mass shooting at Parkland Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida, posted this on YouTube. I'm going to be a professional school shooter, just a few months before the attack. This was missed by law enforcement, by FBI, and should not have been missed. But it's a great example of identifying with previous shooters and then posting this. And sometimes these young people will leak this material out as they're thinking about it, or they'll try to show off to other people. The Uvalde shooter, Salvador Ramos, was showing off to girls. They were playing a video game and he was interacting with some teenage girls and showing off to them that he was going to be a school shooter. And one of them replied back, "Cool." Okay, I showed you the picture, and here's the actual image that was from the Warren Commission report on Marina mocking Lee, the hunter of fascists, ha ha ha. It's written in Cyrillic up there, in Cyrillic and Russian on the top right. So that's part of the Warren Commission's exhibits. Pathway refers to planning, preparing, acquiring weapons, surveilling a place before doing an attack. So pathway is kind of a late stage warning behavior. And in Lee's case, he would have seen the presidential motorcade route published in the newspaper. They don't do this anymore. Right before the motorcade came. And so on the left is a newspaper clipping from the Dallas newspaper. Many people ask like why he didn't shoot coming up Houston Street and why he waited for Kennedy's limousine to turn left on Street. And there's a couple of explanations for that. One is if you look out the window and you're holding a rifle, you're going to be seen more easily by people around you if you poke out that 6th floor window. So Gerald Posner has stated that he thinks that Oswald didn't shoot there because he would have been seen easily pointing the weapon so boldly out the window in that direction. Whereas shooting on Elm Street, it would have been a little bit more secluded and he was able to crouch down and have a little more concealment to avoid detection. Another reason might be some people like to have a rising target versus a falling target as they're shooting because it's easier to see the target, and so that might be another reason. And the limousine would have slowed down quite a bit to make that sharp angle turn, and perhaps he was knowing that that was going to happen or thinking that that might happen. And here's the Mannlicher Carcano rifle. And this gun has some very odd characteristics. It will cause the bullet to tumble after it penetrates through an object like a person's body. So people have done test fires of this rifle. And if you shoot it through gelatinous material, which is often used to measure the velocity and damage that a bullet can do, it'll start tumbling when it comes out the other side. So it's an unusual rifle in terms of it's not a commonly used one, let's put it that way. But he paid $21 for it under the name H. Heidel from a catalog where he mail ordered the gun. Okay, 7 months before JFK, what is Oswald doing? He is surveilling, watching for this man, General Edwin Walker, who was running for governor of Texas back in this era. And Governor Walker was a fiery politician, very much focused on right-wing, some would say racist ideologies. And Oswald was thinking I could be a hero if I take this guy out within his subculture. So a bullet was recovered from Walker's house following the attempt on his life. And after Oswald shot the bullet, he thought he had gotten Walker because he was right in the crosshairs. Same rifle he used to shoot JFK. Thought he got him, went home, turned on the radio, told Marina, hey, I got this guy, I killed him. And he turns on the radio and finds out that Walker survived. And he wasn't even hit by the bullet. And so what investigators found is that the bullet hit the frame of the window where Walker was sitting. And because the magnification was directed towards Walker and not the window, he wouldn't have seen through his sights where the window exactly was located. Because you got to focus in. All right, distal characteristics, 8 out of 10. I'll give you another example of a identification and last resort warning behavior. This is Dylan Roof, who perpetrated an attack on the African American church in Charleston, South Carolina, 2015. And what Roof did is he walked into this church and listened to these members talking about the Bible and God, and sat there and listened to them for like an hour, and then took out his gun and shot 9 of them dead right there. And in his digital profile, they found these kinds of statements: I have no choice, I'm not in a position to alone go into the ghetto and fight. I chose Charleston because it is the most historic city in my state, and at one time had the highest ratio of blacks to whites in the country. We have no skinheads, no real KKK, no one doing anything but talking on the internet. Well, someone has to have the bravery to take it to the real world, and I guess it has to be me, he says. His attorney said that he essentially downloaded all of this material from Google searches. And it's quite extraordinary that a person can absorb this type of radicalization so quickly through online interaction. Okay, thwarting academic and occupational goals. As I stated, Lee attended 11 different schools, was chronically truant. He was court-martialed twice in the Marines. His fellow Marines nicknamed him Oswaldovich. Why they call him that? Because when they were asked to do marches, he thought that they were being forced to do things that were unpleasant. And he said, see, these are the capitalists making you do this. You know, the communists wouldn't do this, only the capitalists would do this. So they nicknamed him Oswaldovich. And you can imagine the humiliation again. Imagine how humiliated he must have been to have fellow Marines calling him Oswaldovich, his wife mocking him for wanting to be a hunter of fascists, and this intense desire he has to be a historical figure just continues throughout his life. Trouble building a successful career. And by the way, when he defected to the Soviet Union and he wrote a letter to his mother, what did he ask his mother? Well, he asked her how she was doing, but what he really wanted to know is what the newspapers in America were saying about him. Because he thought defecting to the Soviet Union would be a huge splash news story, a special news story, because an American soldier was defecting to the Soviet Union. And of course, there was hardly anything about him. But there was a small story in a Texas newspaper that mentioned that this man defected and went to the Soviet Union, but it wasn't the big story that he wanted it to be. All right, I talked about the Derringer 22 shooting himself. In another scene or another place, he staged a scene where he fired at these imagined men in the woods. He was seen shaking and crying. And this was another incident where his fellow Marines thought that he was faking all of this stuff to get out of service, because he didn't want to be deployed with his unit. He defected to Russia, bleeding unconscious. I talked about that. He also tried to convince Marina to hijack a plane to Cuba when they moved to New Orleans. So when he tried to shoot Edwin Walker, Marina was really upset by this and said, we got to get out of here. So they moved to New Orleans, where Lee was handing out Fair Play for Cuba activist pamphlets, which nobody took, and he was interviewed by a news station there too. You can find that on YouTube. Tried to convince Marina to hijack a plane to Cuba because that was the big thing that people would do to gather attention back then. I wanted to show you again the Nazi salute from Breivik that I talked about earlier, the Oslo, Norway killer that they thought was schizophrenic but really wasn't. And Oswald is doing a salute here too. It's a leftist salute with his fist, and you can see this image when he first is presented to the press. He comes out of this door, first thing he does is he puts his hands up like this, and he's handcuffed and he's giving that fist salute. And this is seen as a leftist salute. Okay, so in my book I make the argument that they're coming around, by the way, to take questions that you may have, so please let them know if you have questions. In my book, I talk a little bit about, could the attack have been thwarted? And I think that if we coded Oswald's behavior using modern threat assessment tools, the answer is yes. Why? Because when Oswald defected to the Soviet Union, tried to come back, the State Department, obviously everybody was worried that this man just defected to the Soviet Union, wants to come back. FBI started monitoring him. He was very upset with agents for what he said was disturbing his family and disturbing Marina and asking questions and watching him. And when he came back, what could have happened in a modern joint terrorism task force is they could have flagged him as a threat because of his failure to affiliate to the Soviet Union. And the parallel to draw there would be, imagine if somebody defected from the US, went to Putin's Russia, and for whatever reason, Putin didn't want him, so they sent him back here. Well, that would be flagged as a threat to the United States, that failure to affiliate. And it actually came from work from a retired FBI agent, Kathleen Puckett, who identified that members of jihadist belief systems would try to affiliate with ISIS or Hamas or some other terrorist group, and they would, for whatever reason, the affiliation would not occur, and they would come back and then do an attack, lone actor attack, in the West. So that's called failure to affiliate. So it's an important marker in these cases. 11 different schools, trouble building a career, mental health history. So at age 13, Oswald was so truant to school that the court ordered him to see a psychiatrist. And so we have an age 13 psychiatric report on Oswald, which Dr. Hartog wrote had a personality pattern disturbance with schizoid features, passive aggressive tendencies. Lee has to be seen as an emotionally quite disturbed youngster who suffers under the impact of really existing emotional isolation and deprivation, lack of affection, absence of family life, and rejection by a self-involved and conflicted mother. His mother was very dramatic and probably had a similar personality disorder as Lee did. In my book, I argue that Lee has a borderline personality disorder, which is commonly seen in individuals who harm themselves, try to get attention by doing these kinds of extreme things, behaviors. So Dr. Hartog's report, I did something to try to gather more clinical information. I took Lee's psychiatric report and gave it to 3 child psychiatrists at Washington University and didn't tell them who it was. And all 3 of them thought that based on the behaviors that were documented that he could have had either reactive attachment disorder or a neurodevelopmental disorder like autism, that those would be the differential in today's world if we were evaluating him today. But none of those things make people into an assassin, right? There's other components that have to happen. Okay, the 6th floor museum has a wonderful artifact, and that is Oswald's wedding ring. And this is called the last resort behavior, proximal warning behavior, in which a person believes they must act now. So on November 21st, 1963, Lee went to see his wife, Marina, in Irving. He was at a room house here in Dallas at the time, working at this Texas Book Depository building. He went to see her because they were having marital problems and they had separated from one another, and he wanted to try to win her back. So he went there and said, you know, I'll buy you a washing machine. You know, he's trying hard to reconcile. And she said, no, Lee. She was really angry with him. And so as they were in the room together, he wouldn't let her out of the room. And he said, I want you to kiss me first. And she refused. And so after a couple of times of refusing, she finally kissed him just to make him get out of the doorway so she could get out of the door. And the next day, on the morning of November 22nd, 1963, Oswald left the ring in a teacup in a dresser in the room, which is a symbol, psychological symbol of this last resort. So if I'm not going to get my family, my wife back, then I'm going to go be a great historical figure. And threat assessment people call this last resort warning behavior. Some school shooters will do this too, as they're trying to either have something with their family goes wrong or something at school goes wrong, and they have this last resort. If this doesn't work, then I'm going to go do this big action. Okay, so just to summarize, overvalued belief is that he believes he's a Marxist-Leninist. His thymotic drive, his need for legacy and fame-seeking, is seen in his, what he calls, historic diary. And if you look at the ad for my talk, up at the top, it's written historic diary. That's the diary that he wrote when he was in Russia. And he doesn't just call it a diary, he calls it a historic diary because he wants to be a historic figure. And archetypes are being a hunter, warrior. So I'm going to end with talking about what we need to do to stop school shooters. And I think that the work here that we've seen shows us that overvalued beliefs and shared beliefs in digital subcultures are element one. Developing status and iconic status, legacy, historical figures is the second part for these young people, these kids in schools or recent graduates of schools. And this archetype of being a warrior, avenger, or outlaw. And with that, today is January 20th, it's actually Inauguration Day. And I'll just say that we can quote President Kennedy for today's world and say that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century who are tempered by lockdowns at school, by traumas that they have to encounter, thinking about not being safe, about being gunned down while they're learning in a classroom. And I don't think anybody thought in 1963 that this is where we would be today. But I'm hoping that the legacy of the JFK assassination, the museum, can be one of positive energy. President Kennedy said, let's go to the moon, and this is our moonshot now, is this problem. Thank you for listening to me.